On the 4th of July 1946, on a huge hill in Gdansk in front of a large crowd of thousands, there were a number of men and women brought out for their executions. These were the former concentration camp guards of Stutthof, a site which was known for its brutality during the Second World War, and the executions were incredibly public. They were not performed inside the privacy of a prison, and the intention for this was that so many people who flocked to witness the killings would see that justice was being administered. Many of these people had suffered heavily during the Second World War, and even the executioners that day were the former prisoners of those guards who they secured the noose around the neck of. But the gallows that were constructed especially for these executions were huge and colossal, and they stood incredibly tall. Welcome to the fortress. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The gallows situated on Biskupia Gorka Hill in Gdansk were constructed for the executions of those former guards condemned after the first Stutthof trials. They were taken swiftly down after the executions had been carried out, and the size of them was so large that changes had to be made for the executions to even be performed. Usually executioners inside the land would pass the rope over the crossbeam, and then the victim was stood on a stool, which was then removed after the noose was secured. But a number of vehicles were used for the executions, and these acted as the platform. The gallows on Biskupia Gorka were numerous, and there were specifically 5 of them. 4 of these, the ones on the outside, allowed for 2 people to be hanged on at the same time, and the middle gallows was special as it had 2 beams of wood running vertically, meaning that when a crossbeam was placed on top, there were 3 sections for 3 people to be hanged on. On the gallows were rings at the top, and the noose was passed through these, and they were surrounded by sand, which was there to soak up any blood or excrement which came after the execution of the person began. Let's remember that those people who were hanged on these gallows were some of the most despicable war criminals of the Second World War. There were 5 women who were executed that day, and these were Eva Paradis, Wanda Clark, Gerda Steinhoff, Elizabeth Becker, and Jenny Wanda Barkmann. Each of these women were known for their violent actions inside the nearby Stutthof Concentration Camp, and a number of them had been residents of Gdansk and had grown up in the city, near to where they were being executed. But the lure of the wages that the SS paid, as well as the thought of wielding power over prisoners, was enough to convince these women, many of whom were in their early 20s, to go and work at the site and to take up work inside a concentration camp. Jenny Wanda Barkmann was known as the Beautiful Spectre for her beauty, but also her dark behaviour, and she was, when she was at trial, seemingly more concerned with flirting with the guards who kept a close eye on her, and she also seemed more bothered with her hair. She also laughed at the former prisoners when they gave evidence against her. The men condemned that day were Johann Pauls, Tadeusz Kopczynski, Wacław Kozłowski, Józef Reiner, Franciszek Sobzinski, and Jan Brajst. Some of these men were capos who were prisoner functionaries, and these were men who were given power and were hated by other inmates, as the capos themselves were incarcerated, but they wielded a lot of power over others. Each of these men and women were known for their terror and also their brutality, and many had been seen and witnessed sending prisoners to their deaths inside of Stutthof's gas chamber, where 4,000 perished. With regards to the executions on the huge gallows, the process was as followed. A number of vans were used for the executions, and these acted as the scaffold and the floor of the gallows. The vehicles were backed up under the execution structure, and then each of the condemned former guards of the concentration camp were helped onto the back of the trucks. Also stood on the vehicle was the executioner, who was a prisoner of Stutthof, and they were dressed in their uniforms that they were forced to wear inside the camp. An official read out the death warrant and reminded the huge crowd of thousands who witnessed the executions what these men and women had done and what they'd been condemned for. The executioner then helped the condemned onto a stool, and they secured the noose tightly around their necks. Someone then knocked on the cab of the truck, instructing the driver to slowly pull forward, and with this the men and women were then left hanging and swinging wildly on the gallows. It was an execution using strangulation, as there was no drop at all, and it was very slow strangulation, and could take many minutes for someone to die. The survival instincts of the human body and of the condemned kicked in as they were hanging, and they were kicking and fighting for their lives, but then after some minutes of wriggling, the body went taut as the air was choked out of their bodies. One by one the guards of Stutthof were executed on these huge gallows. These executions using the gallows attracted a lot of criticism inside of the Polish church, as members of the clergy found it too shocking, medieval and barbaric, and they believed that these killings should have been at least performed inside the privacy behind the walls of the local prison. The next set of executions involving former guards of Stutthof did occur inside Gdansk's city prison in the years after, but the Biskupia Gorka executions were almost like a local carnival. It was described as almost like a fun fair, with the atmosphere, and there were locals who set up stalls and sold food and refreshments for the crowd and made money from the proceedings. It was almost medieval, and they even sold ice cream as if the crowd were witnessing a film inside of a movie theatre. The executions on the gallows were performed every 12 minutes, and the women were condemned first on the closest set of gallows. The first executed was Jenny Wanda Barkmann, and then every 12 minutes the rest of the former guards were hanged in sequence, and those who were near the end of the execution schedule had to wait for almost 2 hours, witnessing the executions of their former colleagues, knowing that they soon would be next. These were men and women who worked inside of a concentration camp where over 65,000 people died, and the site of Stutthof was known for its horror. The conditions of the camp were terrible, and prisoners succumbed to terrible diseases which swept through the site, the extreme forced labour conditions and starvation, along with a lack of medical care and other facilities. There were even dozens of thousands of prisoners who were executed in the evacuations of the camp, with many machine gunned down inside of the sea, which they were forced to march to. The guards who were executed on the gallows were responsible for the conditions of Stutthof Concentration Camp, and these were men and women who had inflicted suffering onto so many. The gallows on Biskupia Gorka Hill that day were taken down following the executions, and the intention was to make the most public executions that could be possibly carried out. It was a throwback to the medieval and Tudor period inside of England, as thousands would flock to witness the public killing of criminals, and the anger inside of Poland at the end of the Second World War was immense. Local officials made the decisions to show that these men and women who had inflicted suffering within the local concentration camp had justice coming their way. It was only these executions that occurred on these gallows, and later the other executions of the Stutthof guards were carried out within the confines of the local prison. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.